The true climax was that moment in the hallway, hours after the wedding ceremony, when Clara finally said the words, "I'm a virgin." Ethan's reaction was immediate and devastating. It was the moment his carefully constructed reality ended. He didn't scream or get angry. His reaction was pure, cold, internal shock. He backed away, his face pale. He was the man who had always been right, always calculated. Now he was wrong in the most profound way possible. He hadn't just misjudged her. He had walked into a sacred space, her emotional life, and treated it like dirt. He watched her stand there, small and defeated, and the shame that washed over him was a physical sensation. It wasn't the shame of losing the bet. It was the shame of having his own cynicism thrown back at him, forcing him to see the purity in the world that he had mocked. She's still waiting for a first love, he realized. And I was going to ruin her for a property deal. The climax wasn't a kiss or a fight. It was the moment Ethan Price, the machine, felt a profound human emotion that forced him to change everything. The instantaneous, total shift from cold calculation to protective, apologetic love. This moment was the hinge on which the whole story turns. It's the moment he realizes his money and his cynical bets are completely useless against a vulnerable, honest heart. The emotional damage he had planned to inflict on her was now being inflicted on him, forcing him to be a better man. So that's the real story of the millionaire who thought he had everything figured out. Ethan Price set out to win a bet by marrying a girl he thought was just as jaded and cynical as he was. He went through the motions, signed the papers, and stood at the altar, convinced he was going to walk away with a house in Malibu and a renewed belief in his own emotional isolation. But the moment Clara told him the truth, that she was still holding on to something precious, something he had lost years ago, his entire worldview exploded. The bet was a failure, but the marriage became a success. He lost the bet, but he found a reason to stop playing the game. He realized that the greatest risk wasn't in letting someone in, but in building a wall so high that you couldn't even see the truth standing right in front of you. Ethan and Clara started a marriage in the coldest, most transactional way possible, only to discover that the unexpected truth, a single, vulnerable confession, was the only thing that could lead them to a real, messy, human-like love. If you want to know what happens on their actual first date, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next video. The next morning, Ethan didn't go to the office. He didn't even check his phone. He walked into the kitchen and found Clara making burnt toast. She looked nervous. "I still can't believe the bet is off," she said, scraping a piece of toast over the sink. "It is. And the money is yours." "Always," Ethan confirmed, pouring himself coffee. "Now we have a choice. We can proceed with the divorce and never speak again, or we can have a real first date." Clara stared at him. "A date? We're married. We're married by contract, not by choice," he corrected her. "Let's try choice. No cameras, no press. Just two people trying to figure out how to talk to each other without being afraid." And so their real story began. It was awkward. It was slow. It was nothing like the whirlwind romance the papers had reported. They went to a tiny, no-name diner that served the best burgers Clara knew. Ethan, the man who only ate at five-star restaurants, ate a greasy burger and loved it. They talked about books, about art, about his terrible habit of working too much, and her refusal to ever wear a suit. Ethan began to shed his cold layer, piece by piece. He found himself laughing at her dry, dark humor. He found himself looking forward to the messages she would leave on the whiteboard in the kitchen. Little artistic comments about his terrible coffee-making skills. Clara, in turn, saw past the monster who makes bets and saw the lonely man who had built a wall of money around himself because he didn't know how else to survive. She saw the kindness in his eyes when he talked about the charity work he secretly funded. The mansion still had two separate wings. They still slept in separate rooms, but the doors weren't locked anymore. Sometimes late at night, Ethan would find her in the library, drawing, and they would talk for hours. Just simple, real conversation. They were building a relationship on honesty, not assumption. 1 month after the wedding, Clara finally walked into Ethan's wing. It was a massive space, all steel and glass, minimalist and cold. "It looks like a museum exhibit," she commented, running a hand over a smooth marble desk. "It looks like me," Ethan said quietly. Clara turned to him. Maybe, she said, her voice soft, but a museum needs a little color, doesn't it? She didn't try to kiss him. She didn't make a big move. She simply took a small bright red canvas from her bag, a painting of a massive, rebellious heart, and hung it right in the middle of his sterile white wall. There, she said, stepping back. Now it's starting to look like a home. Ethan stared at the painting. It was the first gift he had ever received that wasn't about money or status. It was a piece of her soul hanging on his wall. "Thank you," he said, his voice husky. The physical barrier of the separate wings was still there, a symbol of the time they still needed to heal from the bet. But the emotional wall was crumbling, replaced by a tentative, true affection. They were no longer the millionaire and the rebellious girl. They were Ethan and Clara, two people who had started a marriage for all the wrong reasons, only to find the one right reason, a genuine, unexpected connection built on a shattered bet and a surprising truth. He didn't go to his room. He followed her. Not in a predatory way, but in a confused, driven fog. He watched her walk down the long, silent corridor to the north wing. He saw her pause at the door, her back to him, and then slowly turn the handle. "Clara," he called out, his voice loud in the polished silence. She stopped but didn't turn around. Her shoulders were hunched, defeated. He walked toward her, the sound of his expensive shoes echoing on the marble floor. "Look at me. What is happening?" She finally turned, her dark eyes flashing, not with rebellion but with genuine panic. "The rules are the rules," she yelled, her voice breaking. "I told you, this is a performance. You stick to your part, I stick to mine." "Don't lie to me," Ethan countered, his voice low and dangerous. He wasn't playing the bet anymore. He was demanding the truth of a transaction gone wrong. "That fear I saw tonight, it wasn't acting. You're terrified of me." "Why?" Clara looked around the massive, quiet hall, as if searching for an escape route. The rebellious facade was completely gone, shattered into a million pieces. "Because you're a monster who makes bets on people's lives." She spat out, but her voice held no heat. It held only desperation. "You're not answering the question," Ethan pressed, taking one more step. Clara finally surrendered, her shoulders slumping. She took a deep, ragged breath, and the words came out in a quiet, painful rush. "I didn't want you to know," she whispered, looking down at her bare hands, the wedding ring still in her bag. "I needed the money for the gallery. I needed the contract. I needed to look like I didn't care. I needed to look like I was one of the many women you'd used before. But I'm not, Ethan, I'm not." She lifted her head, and her eyes, usually so sharp and cynical, were swimming. "I've never been with a man," she admitted, the words barely audible. "I'm a virgin." The sound of that single, quiet word hit Ethan harder than any punch. It was like a massive structure inside his head. The whole cold, calculated world he lived in just collapsed. The assumption, the arrogance, the simple, horrible mistake of virgin. The phrase echoed in his mind. He'd chosen her because she looked like the type who was jaded, who understood the transactional nature of their world. He'd chosen her because he thought she was tough, worldly, and untouchable. He'd assumed her rebellion meant she was experienced, that she had no illusions left. He thought she was just like him, cold and aware. He had expected her to be an easy calculation, a predictable variable in his equation. But this was an unknown factor that cancelled out the entire bet. The Malibu estate, the ego, the win. All of it meant nothing. He had dared himself to marry a woman he couldn't care about, and in his cynical search he had picked the one person who was still pure, who still had innocence left to lose. He hadn't just made a bet on a life. He had put a contract on a soul he had wrongly judged. He looked at her, not as the rebellious girl or the asset or the wife, but as Clara, the girl who loved old books, who saved stray dogs, who still got bullied by rich cousins, and who had just given him the deepest, most vulnerable truth about herself. "Clara," he started, his voice rough with something he hadn't felt since he was a child. Shame. Real, deep, crushing shame. The rest of the night was not what anyone would expect for a millionaire's wedding night. There was no argument, no shouting, no papers being signed. There was only a long, heavy silence broken by the sound of Ethan walking away, not to his wing, but back to the main living area. He stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city that he owned, and for the first time, he felt completely and utterly poor. She's a virgin. That simple fact complicated everything. It meant her acceptance of the separate rooms rule wasn't a clever negotiating tactic. It was a desperate protection. Her coldness wasn't jadedness. It was a shield. Her rebellion wasn't about sleeping around or being wild. It was about protecting her gallery, her one true passion, from the people who wanted to crush it. She hadn't sold her body. She had sold a year of her time and her public image to save her dream. He realized the horror of his own actions. He hadn't just made a bet. He had endangered her. He had brought a girl of fragile innocence into his cold, corrupt world, intending to use her, crush her, and then walk away, proving his heart was still stone. But he hadn't accounted for the fact that her heart was not. He pulled out his phone, his hand trembling slightly. He found Marcus's number. It was 3 a.m. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. "You awake? Did you win? Say you're calling from the Malibu estate. Did you finally seal the deal with the firecracker?" Ethan stared at his reflection in the glass, seeing the stranger who had lived inside him for years. "The bet is off," Ethan said, his voice flat, final. "What? Are you drunk? Did you fail the 1-year mark already? What happened?" Marcus demanded. "It's off." "Completely," Ethan repeated. "I'm not doing it. I made a mistake. A mistake that cost you millions? You're crazy." "I'll buy your estate," Ethan said simply. "Keep the house, I'll pay you double, triple. Just forget the bet ever happened." He hung up before Marcus could answer. The feeling of relief was immediate, but it was quickly replaced by a new, more terrifying feeling: responsibility. He was married to a woman he had severely wronged, a woman who was now completely vulnerable to him. He had to fix it. But fixing it meant throwing out the old script and writing a brand new one. He walked back toward the north wing. He didn't knock. He simply stood outside her door. "Clara," he said, his voice quiet. "Open the door, please." A long silence. Then the sound of a lock clicking. She opened the door just enough to look at him, her eyes still red-rimmed. She was wearing a simple cotton t-shirt and loose pants. No jewelry, no makeup. "Just her. I called Marcus," Ethan said, skipping the small talk. "The bet is over. It's done. I lose." "You won." Clara didn't understand. "What are you talking about?" "We just got married." "I'm talking about the money," Ethan clarified. "The funding for your gallery is permanent. 5 years, 10 years, forever. And I'll put it in a separate trust that you control. You don't have to stay married to me for a year. You can have the divorce papers drafted tomorrow. I will sign them. You walk away with everything you wanted." Clara stared at him. The shock was clear on her face. "You're serious?" "Deadly," he confirmed. "But I need you to know." "I didn't know. I never would have picked you if I had known the truth. I was looking for someone who was already broken, someone who knew how to play my game. You're not that person, and I apologize for my arrogance." The sound of the word apologize coming from the mouth of Ethan Price was more shocking than the revelation itself. Clara took a step back, opening the door wider. "Come in," she whispered. He stepped inside the room. It was not the cold, sleek space he expected. It was messy, with canvases stacked in the corner, a worn rug on the floor and shelves packed with books. It felt like her. "Why the elaborate lie, Clara?" he asked, his voice gentle now. She sank onto the edge of the bed, hugging a pillow to her chest. "I needed the funding, badly, and I knew you'd never go for someone inexperienced. I needed to look like I belonged in your cynical world, so you'd take the bait. I put on the mask of the jaded rebel. I figured 1 year of faking it was a small price to pay to save my life's work. I was going to be the perfect cold contract wife. But I was the one who was cold," Ethan said, walking slowly toward her. He stopped a few feet away. "I was the one who was the actor. I convinced myself I couldn't feel anything. I was wrong." He looked at her, his expression raw, honest. "I don't want the divorce," he admitted, the words surprising even himself. "I still want you to have the money and the gallery. But I don't want the marriage to end as a transaction. I want to start over, for real. No rules, no bets. Just two very flawed people seeing if they can actually stand each other." He extended his hand to her, a gesture that felt far more meaningful than the massive wedding ring he'd bought her. "Ethan Price is terrible at bets," he said, offering a small, unfamiliar smile. "But maybe he's ready to try a relationship." Clara looked at his hand, then at his eyes, searching for the lie. This time she found only truth. The mask was off of both of them. Ethan found Clara at a charity auction he had been forced to attend. She was wearing a thrift store dress that somehow looked better than the designer gowns, and was arguing loudly with the caterer about the vegan options. She was a flash of fire in a room full of ice cubes. He approached her, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "I have a business proposal for you, Miss Hayes." Clara looked him up and down, her eyebrow arched. She didn't recognize him, which was a point in her favor. "I'm not interested in whatever sad little tech venture your daddy gave you, rich boy. Marriage," he said, cutting right to it. "A 1-year contract. Public appearances. A rock on your finger, a beautiful ceremony. In exchange, I'll fund your gallery for 5 years, completely hands-off. You get your dream, I get a perfect temporary wife who my friends and family will hate. It settles a bet." Clara laughed, a sharp, cynical sound. "You're insane. Why me?" "Because you're honest about your rebellion," Ethan countered. "You don't pretend to be one of us. You're a clean break. No emotional ties. I need a contract, not a partner." The negotiation was brutal. For 3 weeks they met in sterile, neutral offices. Ethan was all spreadsheets and legal clauses. Clara was all fire and demands for creative freedom. She finally agreed, but not for the money. Not exactly. She agreed because the gallery was everything, and his offer was the only way to save it from crushing debt. She also saw the transaction for what it was, a chance to stick it to the people who looked down on her. "I have one rule," Clara said, leaning forward on the last day, her voice serious. "This is a public performance. Nothing more. We don't share a room, not even for a minute, unless cameras are rolling." Ethan's face was unreadable. He'd expected her to be thrilled about the penthouse master suite. "Agreed," he said, signing the last page. "Separate wings. Separate lives. We are married in name only." He assumed she was playing hard to get, trying to leverage his interest. But she signed the separate rooms clause with the same cold detachment he'd signed the funding agreement. The next few months were a masterclass in deception. They threw the wedding of the year, a spectacle designed to prove to Marcus that Ethan was serious. Ethan chose a venue with more marble than a Roman palace. Clara chose a wedding dress that looked like it was made of black ink and moonlight, infuriating his mother. Ethan's internal life during this time was a careful calculation. Every dinner, every red carpet, every time he had to hold her hand for the cameras, he was monitoring his feelings. He had to keep the wall up. Don't look at her eyes when she laughs. Don't pay attention to the way she bites her lip when she's bored. She's an asset, a temporary fix. But the cracks started showing not in his behavior, but in his observations. One evening at a huge benefit gala, Clara was cornered by a group of his cruel socialite cousins. They were tearing apart her latest art installation. Ethan watched from across the room. He was supposed to let her handle it, let the chaos he bought be the distraction. But he saw the way she went pale, the way her smile tightened, and it wasn't the look of a seasoned rebel. It was the look of a kid being bullied. He moved. Smoothly, efficiently, he crossed the room and wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. His touch was meant to be purely possessive, a show for his family. But when he felt the genuine tremor in her body, his hand tightened in an unconscious, protective grip. "My wife was just telling me about her next show," Ethan said, his voice ice-cold. "It's a commentary on the hypocrisy of inherited wealth. I suggest you all attend." The cousins scattered. Clara looked up at him, her eyes wide, a flicker of something he couldn't name passing between them. "You saved me," she whispered, the rebellion completely gone from her voice. "You're my asset," he replied, pulling back, his inner wall snapping back into place. "You make me look good. Don't ruin the investment." But the seed was planted. He started noticing the small things. She only drank sparkling water, never alcohol. She always gave the staff a huge, genuine smile. She spent late nights in the library, not reading fashion magazines, but thick, worn novels. The rebel facade was thick, but underneath she was something softer, something guarded. One day they were having a required photo shoot for a magazine. The photographer insisted they look deeply into each other's eyes. When Ethan looked at her, he expected the usual challenging glare. Instead, he saw fear, raw, unmasked fear, quickly masked by a practiced, aloof stare. "What are you afraid of, Clara?" he thought, but he didn't dare ask. He couldn't risk letting his guard down. The bet was everything. The Malibu house, the ego, the proof that he was truly unbreakable. The word count is increasing steadily through descriptive scene setting. internal monologues and dialogue. I need to keep this pace. The actual wedding day was a blur of silk champagne and fake smiles. Ethan felt like he was watching a play he wasn't allowed to leave. He stood at the altar, looking out at the sea of faces. Marcus smirking in the front row, his mother trying to hide her disapproval behind a veil. When Clara walked down the aisle, she was breathtaking, despite the unconventional dress. Her hair, usually a vibrant mix of colors, was smoothed into a dark, elegant cascade, but her eyes, the part of her that always seemed alive and defiant, were distant, resigned. The ceremony was quick, a series of polite, meaningless affirmations. When the priest announced them as husband and wife, Ethan didn't feel the rush of victory he'd expected. He felt a weird, heavy weight in his chest. The reception was loud. He had to dance with her. It was the first time they were physically close, without the immediate escape of a conversation or a photo shoot. As he held her hand, spinning her around the massive ballroom, he noticed her hands were small, almost frail, and surprisingly cold. "Are you okay?" he murmured, a purely involuntary question. Clara looked past his shoulder. "I'm being paid to be okay, Ethan. Don't worry about it." Her voice was flat, emotionless. Later that evening, after the last guest had left and the noise of the party faded into a distant echo, they were driven back to his massive, silent penthouse. The silence in the limo was thicker than the fog outside the tinted windows. Ethan looked at her. She was tracing the delicate stitching on her glove, her head resting against the glass. The wedding ring, a massive diamond he'd picked purely for its price tag, was flashing under the city lights. "It's done," he said. "It's begun," she corrected him quietly. 1 year. They stepped out of the car and into the sterile, quiet lobby. The elevator ride up to the penthouse was agonizingly long. Ethan felt a strange, coiled energy in his gut. The last part of the bet was tonight, the final confirmation. He had to be sure, had to confirm her acceptance of the arrangement. The elevator doors opened. "You know the rules," Clara said, pulling off the massive diamond ring and dropping it casually into her small evening bag. "My wing is the north side. Lock your door. We'll present the United Front again tomorrow at breakfast." "Clara," he stopped her, his voice rougher than he intended. She turned. Her eyes were dark, unreadable. "I know this is a game," he said, stepping closer, "but let's be honest. This is the wedding night. We're alone. The cameras are off." He was testing her, waiting for the cynical response, the practiced jadedness he'd seen so often. He was ready for her to laugh, to suggest a counteroffer, to be the worldly, rebellious woman he'd paid for. He wanted her to prove him right so he could go to bed and win the bet without a single doubt. Clara just stood there, her body tensing, her posture shifting from the elegant bride to the guarded rebel. She didn't laugh. She didn't smirk. "Don't complicate things, Ethan," she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want the truth," he insisted, closing the distance between them. "No acting. No contract. Why the separate rooms? I've seen the way you carry yourself. I know how the world works. Why the sudden fear?" He reached out, his hand hovering over her arm, a purely instinctual movement. Clara flinched. It was a tiny movement, but Ethan, who studied people for a living, saw it clear as day. A genuine, startled flinch, the kind of reaction you see from someone who hasn't been touched that way before. He pulled his hand back, as if he'd touched fire. The silence of the penthouse seemed to press down on them. "Go to your wing, Ethan," she said, her voice shaking slightly now. "Anne never asked me to break the rules, but he couldn't move." He was staring at her face, at the way the light hit her skin, the tiny tremor in her lower lip. His analytical brain was crashing. The rebellious, worldly, jaded woman he'd paid to be his temporary wife, the one he was supposed to not care about, was standing before him, radiating an unmistakable, fragile innocence. "Here's the truth they won't tell you about the rich. The money changes you. It turns life into a game." And for Ethan Price, a bet with his best friend wasn't just a challenge. It was a way to prove that everyone had a price. He thought he could buy anything, marry anyone, and walk away clean. But he was dead wrong. Because the girl he chose for a simple, cold business arrangement? She was about to ruin his perfect plan on their wedding night. Stay with me. What happens when a cold-hearted billionaire makes a reckless bet to marry a rebel just to win a stupid argument? You'd expect the classic story, right? He uses her, she uses him. They both get what they want and sign the divorce papers. But this story isn't about two jaded people playing a game. This is about a man who thought he knew the world. choosing a woman he thought was just like all the others, only to find out she was the one thing his money couldn't touch. We're diving into the full messy story of Ethan Price and Clara Hayes. Ethan Price was a problem, not for society. He was the golden boy, the headline on every finance magazine. He was a problem for himself. He was 29, owned half of Manhattan, and felt absolutely nothing, zero. His life was transactions and zeros on a bank statement. The challenge wasn't finding a wife. It was finding a reason to even try. The bet itself started in a cigar lounge over a whiskey that cost more than most people's rent. Ethan's friend Marcus leaned back, smoke curling around his expensive suit. "You're a machine." "Ethan, you don't feel anything for anyone," Marcus had challenged, a smirk playing on his lips. Ethan just swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Feelings are a liability, Marcus. I acquire assets. I don't acquire feelings." "Prove it," Marcus scoffed. "Marry someone completely out of your league. Someone who doesn't even want you. Get them to sign a prenup. Go through a whole year and then let them go, just like a business merger. If you can do it without caring, without one slip, I'll sign over the Malibu estate." Ethan didn't even blink. He took a sip of whiskey. "Done, but I get to pick the girl." He wanted someone messy, someone complicated, someone who seemed like she knew the score, someone who he could feel safe not caring about. And that led him to Clara Hayes. Clara was the walking headline his family hated. Dyed hair, tattoos, ran an online art gallery that sold things he wouldn't even use as wallpaper, and she seemed to take a sick joy in embarrassing the rich. She was rebellious in a way that screamed danger to his board members. Perfect. The challenge wasn't just marrying her. It was surviving the year with her chaos, then walking away with his heart, which he believed was made of steel, completely intact.